At least we get by in between. Not true either. Between the end of the Great Depression and the beginning of this one, that started in December of 2007, there were 12 official economic downturns, variously called business cycles, recessions, other words like that. So this is a system that is extraordinarily unstable. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as this economy, you'd probably move. And if you didn't move, you'd demand that your roommate get some professional help. And yet we all seem to think we have to live with an unstable economic system rather than change it or force it to change, which is something I hope you think about. So what made this one happen? And are we in a serious one? Sure. Just a couple of statistics to keep it in your head. In December of 2007, when this recession officially started, the number of people unemployed in the United States, people looking for work but unable to find it, was a little over 7 million people. That's a lot of people. How many people are counted today in the United States that are looking for work and unable to find it? 15.5 million people. The unemployment in the United States has gone up and up and up. No recovery is going on. It gets worse every month. The number of people facing a legal process in America today, every month, new people facing it every month, this process is called foreclosure. It's when you can't make your mortgage payments and the bank goes into court to throw you out of the house, because that's how a mortgage works. You borrow the money to buy a house. If you can't make the monthly payments, the bank comes and takes the house. That's the security that they have if you don't pay back the loan in the contract you sign. The number of American families being pulled into court now is running at 240,000 per month in the United States. We have a country now in which there are millions, count them, millions of empty houses side by side with millions of families who have no place to live. And we can't fix this. And there's little prospect of it being fixed. When millions of people lose their jobs, they lose their income. And when they lose their income, they stop paying taxes. When companies face workers who have no jobs and therefore no income, they can't sell their goods, so they lay off more people and they don't pay taxes. The result is that the companies pay fewer taxes and the people pay fewer taxes, so the government has less money, so you get the kind of story that Todd opened this meeting with. Cutbacks left and right. And we're only at the beginning. So this is a very serious situation. How did it happen? How do we get ourselves into this mess? One last statistic, just to keep it in your mind. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington, which keeps records of unemployed people, has an interesting number that they publish every month. It's not only the people looking for work who don't have it, what I just gave you a couple of minutes ago, to 15.5 million, but they add two other groups. One group are all the people who have a part-time job but don't want one. They want a full-time job, but they can't find one. And the third group are something called, I love the language here, discouraged workers. What does the government mean by a discouraged worker? That's a person who's given up looking. They've been looking for months, and they no longer look for a job. If you add together the people unemployed, 15.5 million, the people with a part-time job but they don't want one, they want a full-time job, and the people who've given up looking, the discouraged workers, the number is between 25 and 30 million Americans. The unemployment rate, including those three groups, is currently 17.5%. That's 1 out of 6 American working people. That means every family in America has a relative or a friend or a neighbor who's in that situation. So this is not somebody else's economic crisis. It's right next door if it hasn't hit you yet. So let's go now. How? And to tell the story of how we got into this is to tell the story about how our country works. So you're going to have to bear with me for just a few minutes to learn a little bit about American history, perhaps in a way that you haven't heard it before. The United States is a very special country. You know that because every politician has to say that 12 or 16 times a day. But it's true in a certain way. From around 1820, shortly after we become a nation, to 1970, not that long ago, about 150 years, something is true about the American capitalist economy that wasn't true anywhere else. Wages of workers went up every decade. Every 10 years they went up for 150 years. No other country was able to do that for its working class. Now it's true, those workers became more and more productive because they worked harder, they worked faster, they had more machines and better machines to work with, so they were more and more productive. They delivered more and more goods and services to their employer for every hour that they worked, but the employers raised their wages along with their rising productivity. It was, in a sense, a capitalist system that worked real well for 150 years. Employers did better and better, and workers got paid more and more. That's one of the reasons Americans tend to think of themselves as living in a very special place. It was special. Americans also began to believe that living in the United States meant that you somehow were entitled to live the American dream, to deliver to your kids a higher standard of living than you yourself enjoyed. That somehow it was built in. If you work hard and you do your job and you go to school, you will do better and your kids will do better, and you can promise as parents to deliver to your children what your parents were able to deliver to you. It's understandable that Americans came to believe that because they lived that for 150 years. Why did employers pay workers higher wages? Because the employers were nice? Well, I'm sure many of them were nice, but employers don't usually do that just out of niceness. Employers pay workers higher wages, usually and only if they have to. And for those 150 years, they had to. Why? Because for those 150 years, we had in America something economists call a labor shortage. We never had enough people. Now, the reasons for that are not hard to figure out. One, we got rid of all the people that were here when the Europeans first arrived. Some of you noticed that. It's hard to employ people after you've killed them. Or stuck them on a reservation far away. So we didn't have anybody to go work. Everybody here who came from Europe didn't want to be a poor worker as they had been in Europe. They wanted to have the American dream quickly. So there were never enough workers. Even if you got a worker to come over from Europe to settle here, which, by the way, is the major way the United States dealt with a labor shortage. Endless waves of immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants. That's the reason. There was nobody else to do the work. But even if you got an immigrant to work, you never were sure about that immigrant, because since we had a big country and we had gotten rid of the people who were here before, we had lots of free land. And a worker who wasn't happy with his or her job could pick up and move west, ending up in places like California, where they could start all over. So to keep a worker, you had to pay him or her. We had a labor shortage, so wages had to keep rising. Now try to imagine a country, because it's yours, in which for 150 years you improve everybody's standard of living. You pay them higher and higher wages, which these people can now use to buy a home, eventually buy a car, send their kids to school. Amazing things that workers in many other countries couldn't do, still can't. Try to imagine what happens to a culture that believes it's in the very pores of America that that's going to happen to you. Try to imagine if that situation stopped. Because that's what happened in the 1970s. And the crisis we're in now is the product of how we as a nation handled, or better put, didn't handle what happened in the 1970s. So in a nutshell, here's what happened. Wages stopped rising. It's really important that you understand that. Why? Because it should have been part of our national conversation for the last 30 years, but it hasn't been. In the 1970s, wages stopped